This video is about women in prison and mothering. There's some real issues around women as mothers when they are imprisoned. And these come from both the act of becoming a mother in prison through having a child, the act of mothering in prison, breastfeeding and looking after babies in prison, and also having children outside of prison. As mentioned earlier, a substantial number of the women in prison, 85%, are the primary carers of children. In this situation, it is really problematic for women to be removed from the family home, in that many of those children will then end up either with relatives or in the foster system. And this in itself can lead to problems for the children who later on in their life may repeat their mother's errors. It's traumatic, of course, for women to have their children visit them in prison, and many women report rejecting the idea of visiting by their children. They don't want the children exposed to the prison environment. Though this, of course, causes issues for the women who then can't see the children, and children who can't see their mothers. In addition to that, the women are dematernalised in the sense that they lose contact with their children's needs and the day-to-day requirements for their children, including things like being in touch with schools, knowing what their children like, what clothes their children are wearing, how to choose the clothes their children like, etc., etc., especially if their imprisonment is for years at a time. In addition to that, some women actually become mothers while in prison or have more children while in prison. This can happen in a number of ways. Obviously, some women enter prison pregnant. Some women enter into consensual liaisons with persons who either visit them or others in the prison environment. And more problematically, there are high rates of sexual assault of women in prison by guards, unfortunately. I don't know what the rates are in Queensland, but this is a well-documented issue across many Western countries. And some of those women will unfortunately go ahead and have children while they're in prison, which is a traumatic experience. Though there is medical care, there is a reduced level of medical care compared to prenatal care in the community. In addition, when women actually go into labour, they have to be transported, usually in a prison vehicle, to a hospital or may labour and give birth in the prison. There have been instances where women have not been transported in time because guards delay or disbelieve claims that the woman is in labour. Even when women get to maternity hospitals, in theory they're not supposed to be shackled or restrained while giving birth, but this still happens from time to time and is a particularly frightening and painful experience for women who may not be able to move as needed while they're giving birth. For women who've recently given birth or who give birth in prison, then there are also the issues of looking after their babies while in prison. Queensland prisons do allow for babies and young toddlers to remain with their mother, and in fact have special units for mothers who have babies with them. However, they're still relatively regimented, and the women's schedules are not as flexible as schedules outside of prison would be. Women still have to go to bed when told, get up when told, eat when told, etc. This can have an impact on breastfeeding in that the optimum process for breastfeeding is to breastfeed on demand. That is when the child is hungry. However, if the mother wants food, she has to go to eat when it is time to eat in the prison. She has to go to bed. She has to do other things when told. This can interrupt the breastfeeding schedule, as can the general stress and fear of being in prison, which can also interrupt her ability to bond with her new child. These are all issues other than breastfeeding that men may face in jail. However, the majority of men in jail are not the primary caregivers of their children, and of course they don't generally have babies with them in jail. That doesn't happen. There are trans guys who are in jail, but anecdotally, a lot of them identify as butch women and end up in women's prisons, which are safer for them than men's prisons. The level of rape and sexual assault of trans prisoners is truly horrific in studies across Australia, the US and UK. So it's a lot safer for a trans guy to pose as a woman and be in a women's prison than to be a person with a vagina in a men's prison. And many trans guys don't have bottom surgery because it tends not to be quite as successful as bottom surgery for trans women. In relation to this, Judith Butler has looked at the issues for women in prison, and this is her comment, that they are dematernalised. From the beginning of the arrest process, separated from their children, given inadequate visiting, and very often in very alienating conditions, distanced from information and decision-making about their children, and then expected to reclaim a role which has become foreign to them and their children. That is, when they leave the prison, they have to attempt to step back into that role, despite having been separated from their children and all of the maternal role for some time, often months or years at a time. And similarly, their children have a difficult readjustment process. So parenting and prison are problematic, particularly since many women are first offenders and often in prison for purely financial crimes, such as Centrelink fraud.